I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question maybe, to nominate for me one thing, just one thing, that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations. One novelty, one innovation in thinking about anything, ethical, metaphysical, anything you like. And I must say I've racked my brains over this often enough, and I cannot think of one. I would love to hear if there is one.
Do you accept that challenge?
Absolutely. I think the ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as and heterosexuality, I think they have no precedence. I think the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews. But that is it gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates to. So I think that all of those are and essentially what I'm talking in giving that is I am talking about what makes Western civilization distinctive. And one of the things that absolutely makes Western civilization distinctive, and it's an inheritance of its Christian past, is its assumption that its values are universal. This has been fundamental to the way that Christians have understood their faith, that it is for all of humanity. And to this day, the heirs of that cultural tradition want to believe that their values are not contingent, but somehow are the property of all humanity.
There's no contradiction between saying that the early Christians tried to efface pagan culture. They failed. They smashed a lot of temples and they burned a lot of books. We only have
evidence.
Hang on a second.
What evidence do we have for that?
Well, let me give you an example. We have 7 of Aeschylus's plays, and we know the titles of 70. We have something like a dozen or so of Euripides, and
but
we
what makes
know
you
the
think
names.
that we don't have them because Christians destroyed them?
Well, because the transmission of these things through antiquity, we know right up until the time of Cicero, right up until the time of Diogenes Laertius later on, how many of these documents had survived. And then
but how do we know it was Christians who destroyed them?
Well, we know that Christians destroyed a great deal of the material culture of antiquity.
That?
I mean, all you have to do is just read about the first couple of decades after 380 under Theodosius the First.
But do we have anything in the
whom
Theodosian
you don't mention? You don't mention the Theodosian attack on paganism.
Okay, so let's mention the Theodosian Code.
And right up until 529 AD. Hold on a second, Tom. You had a long go there. Right up to 529 AD, when Justinian closed the school of Athens after 900 years of Plato's Academy was closed and the philosophers were driven out. There had been a systematic attempt to try to efface that the record and the remains of classical civilization in order to impose the Christian view on it. It didn't work in the end, because in the end Christianity had to absorb and adopt it. Look at Aquinas. The reason why Thomism is the official religion, the official philosophy, beg your pardon, of the Roman Catholic religion, is because Aquinas had to take over the Aristotelian corpus wholesale. So, that in itself is enough of an example. But you're trying to stress this idea that there was something really exceptional about the picture of Jesus as he was poor, he was a carpenter's son, he was by the Romans and died a slave's death and so on. This somehow is very special. On the contrary, it's just another example of a debate which had been going on for quite a long time in the classical period about the position of the individual and the relationship that individuals have to others.
I just want to come back to this idea that bands of Christians roamed around destroying copies of Aeschylus.
Go ahead.
We have no evidence for this whatsoever. There's nothing in the Theodosian Code that prescribes that classical works should be destroyed. Indeed, we know that classical works were regularly copied by the monks that Anthony is so dismissive of in the introduction to his book.
Much later on, several centuries.
But you say, remember that by this time the Roman Empire of the East had been transformed into fully Christian Byzantium, no more interested in a careful and full preservation of pre-Christian culture than any other part of Christendom. And you say that insofar as the classical text survived, it was down to the Muslims. The Iliad was first translated into Arabic in 1904. Who do you think was copying the Iliad? How do you think we have Homer? Who is doing it? It's because Christians absolutely recognise that this is part of the fabric of their culture as well, that all good things, as Origen says, are part of our heritage.
Now, you will know better than I. You will know far better than I that the Nestorian region of the Middle East, so the northwestern Middle East, which was one of the first areas to be overrun by the Muslims. If you look at the library lists in the 10th century of Baghdad, the record kept there of the texts that had been preserved and were available and which were translated. That was the great period of translation.
Who do you think was translating them?
Yeah, the Arab and Persian scholars were doing so.
It's Christian monks who are translating them.
It's
Syriac and Greek-speaking monks who are doing the translating, because it's the Greek monks who have the texts.
With great respect, it was the forget the name of the caliph now, who had a dream and said that these texts must be translated from the Greek into Arabic, and indeed that was the moment when the great contribution was made by the Arabics. So hold on one second. That list, that library list, preserved technical and medical and astronomical and mathematical texts from the Greek. Absolutely almost nothing at all of the literature, of the essays, of the theatre, of the plays, and some of the philosophical texts. For something like 5 centuries, about the only thing that was known of Plato was the Timaeus, and this was because
in the Latin West.
In the Latin West.
But we're talking about, you're saying that in the Eastern Roman Empire, they were no more interested in a careful and full preservation of pre-Christian culture than any other part of Christendom, and yet they were transcribing the Iliad. They were transcribing the texts of the Athenian tragedians that we have. They were doing it. They were transcribing Thucydides and Herodotus. I mean, this is simply not true.
No, but you're being very selective there, because
I'm not being. These are the major Greek classics that you are saying that the Christians of Byzantium had no interest in.
And I go on.
The reason for that.
I go on in that passage to say that the monks did begin to do those translations later, several centuries later.
They were doing it the whole way through.
They were not.
It was the fundamental basis of the Roman classical education, and that passed through even when they'd been Christianized, and that's why they continue to copy them. And the reason why this matters is that this is such a basic point, and Anthony is a great scholar.
It's a matter of fact, actually. It's a matter of fact. Anybody can
go and look it up. Anthony's a great scholar and a professor, and you would think that this would be a simple thing for him to go and check. This is a myth that essentially is propagated in the 18th century. The figure who underlies it is Gibbon, with his account that the Serapeum is destroyed by bigoted Christians who destroy the library, and this is, to put it mildly, not exactly what happened.
Okay, there are two matters of fact here.
So that is
I'll let a quick response from Anthony, and then final word.
Two matters of fact which are independently verifiable. The first is that in the continuation of the passage that Tom is quoting from, I say that the monks began to do copying and disseminating later, about 3 centuries after the Theodosian moment. It really got underway. That quite a lot of the preservation of the texts that we have are owed to the Muslims, to Arab and Persian scribes who did a great deal of translating and were retranslated later. 11th and 12th centuries is when, for example, the Aristotelian corpus came back into the West. That's the first matter of fact. The second matter of fact is you can have a look. You can have a look at the amount of publication, of copying, of transmission in I would say the 3 centuries between, well, maybe the 4 centuries between the 4th and the 8th centuries of the Common Era, how much publication there was, how much copying and how much transmission, how little was known in that period. When people talk about a dark age, it's now, of course, fashionable to say it wasn't a dark age, there's a huge amount going on and so on, but how little was published, how little was discussed, how little was known in that period, and that is a matter of fact which is verifiable.
quick response, and then we'll go to our break and we'll come back to this.
Okay, I mean, I think this is really important. Monks were systematically copying. They were copying Virgil in the Latin West. They were copying Horace. They were copying Ovid. That's why they survived. In Constantinople, they were copying Homer. They were copying Herodotus. They were copying Thucydides. That's why they survived. The idea that there was a systematic campaign by evil Christians to eliminate the legacy of classical civilization could not be less true. And this is so clear and transparent a historical fact that it stupefies me that Anthony could even begin to think otherwise. And I think the reason that he thinks otherwise is that it's a myth that he has a huge stake in. And we can trace the origins of this myth because the baddies in this are the monks. And this essentially is an 18th century updating of Protestant propaganda, which decreed that monks could never do anything, and that the bigoted religious people of the Catholic Dark Ages had plunged Christendom into darkness, and Protestantism was all about bringing God's people back into light. Essentially, this Enlightenment myth-making is a recalibration of that. But instead of casting the early church as the model of light that has to be restored, we're now pushing the frontier back and saying that it's Greek philosophy. But it is entirely a myth.